Hi, welcome to our next segment in High Renaissance Art. The last two segments that we looked at Renaissance art in North Europe, and then we switched back to Italy. In Italy, we focused primarily in Florence. So there was a Renaissance too that took place in the city of Venice. However, the style is a little bit different, and it developed a little bit differently in terms of stylistic conventions in that region. So we're going to talk about those differences. So Venice, this is where we're going to be traveling, is situated on the mouth of the Adriatic Sea. And this is a very key position for trade and commerce. And they were also very much influenced by Byzantine art as well, which will you can sort of see when we look at some examples. Venice itself is made up of many tiny islands that are only accessible by boat. This was a huge advantage for defense, and as a result, Venice grew quite powerful. And here's an aerial view, and actually you can see that the island is sort of shaped like a fish. There's some other views of it. I don't know why I have so many. This is a map of the city of Venice, and as you can see, the Grand Canal is sort of the main canal, and it's really a system of canals. It's really beautiful. You've probably seen the gondolas in National Geographic pictures and stuff, but there's this sort of network of canals, but this is the main one, and it really is a beautiful city. It's quite spectacular. Here's an aerial view, and the Grand Canal, right here, this S-curve, bisects the island. During this period, Venice was a very different place compared to the rest of Italy. Because it was situated near water, it really influenced the art in that region. The light was also very different in that region. If you think about all that water and how the light reflects off the water, it was very different than the light in, say, Rome or Florence. So painters in this region are very well known for their depiction of light. Here's an example of a Venetian High Renaissance painting. This is by Giovanni Bellini. It's the San Gobi altarpiece, circa 1478. It's a depiction of the iconic image of the mother and child, and you do start to see this sort of Byzantine influence. The scene definitely takes place inside, and that's what's sort of different about it, is this sort of interior light that they're communicating, or the artist is Giovanni Bellini's communicating in the picture. There's that simulation of the gold mosaic, remember, which was a stylistic convention in early Byzantine art. And the scene looks like it's taking place actually inside the interior of a Venetian church. Here's a detail of the apse, and you see that rounded semicircle space. And then also note the charming depictions of angels. So here's an image from the Church of San Vitale that we looked at earlier when we looked at Byzantine art, just to give you a sense of the influence of Byzantine, the mosaics and the gold and the light. So we didn't study this one in particular. We actually looked at the two mosaics that were adjacent to this one. I'll bring those up really quickly. This is one of the major mosaics that you're responsible for the knowing for the interior of San Vitale, and this was a depiction of Justinian, the emperor. And there's another one that's very similar to this, depicting his wife, and those two were adjacent on that first mosaic that we looked at, just to refresh your memory. So hopefully you can now, I'm going back and looking at the Giovanni Bellini altarpiece, and definitely you can see how they've depicted that. So this is we're going to take a more detailed look at this, and there's some things that I want you to note in the composition. Note the lamp. This is sort of a lamp that's centered over the depiction of the Virgin and Child. And again, they're really focusing on this sort of interior light as opposed to a natural outdoor light. And so the lighting is much different than it would be in terms of how it would look outside in nature. This painting is known as a Sacra Conversazione, meaning sacred conversation. In art, it's a depiction of the Virgin and Child, the Virgin Mary with the infant Jesus, amidst a group of saints in relatively an informal grouping as opposed to more rigid and sort of hierarchical compositions of early period. And so the idea behind this is that the viewer contemplates the gathering of these particular saints. Venetian artists began, and so that was the idea of that sacred conversazione. Getting back to how Venetian artists actually painted, Venetian artists began with color first and then built up from this technique. And this is a technique called Colorito, which is very different than how they did it in the high Renaissance painting in Rome and in Florence, where they would actually outline first and then color in. So please keep those two different techniques separate. So Florence, it was disegno, where they would draw a line or outline and then fill in with color. And then in Venice, it was Colorito, C-O-L-O-R-I-T-O, where they would begin with color first and sort of build up the form from there. Very similar to what Leonardo da Vinci did. And Leonardo did sort of transfer from Rome and Florence to Venice. Or no, I'm sorry, he went to Milan. My bad. That was inaccurate. Sorry about that. But still, in a sort of similar way to Leonardo da Vinci. So I really want you to think about this idea of disegno, D-I-S-E-G-N-O, versus Colorito. So disegno was the Florentine style, and it was focused on the design of a work. Artists would work first on a separate paper of parchment to perfect their design before moving on to canvas. Design, or the actual design, was vital, and drawing was the most important element for perfection. In Venice, however, design was not the area of style that most artists focused on. It was color and the application of color that was important when creating a composition on canvas. And so the Colorito technique appealed to the tactility and expressed an emotional quality about the scene. There's also attention to texture. If we look closely at this detail of St. Francis, there's a softness of the flesh when depicted, and the edges are much softer than when we look at, say, the work of Raphael and Michelangelo. So Venetian painting did share some properties of high Renaissance painting from the mainland of Italy. The use of perspective to give depth, that one-point perspective, pyramidal figures, again, that term, some of you missed it on the quiz last time, Pyramidal figures, and then the composition is balanced both horizontally and vertically. Note how the throne itself almost functions like a halo and calls attention to the Virgin. So we do see that sort of replacement of the halo and using sort of everyday objects to sort of stand in for it. So here's a comparison to show you the differences between the Colorito and disegno technique. So on my right is the image of Madonna and Child done by Raphael, and then we have Bellini's depiction over on the left. Oops. And you really do see a difference. So in the Colorito technique, there's usually, so we're talking about this image over here, is usually a depiction of interior artificial light. Disagonal is mostly natural light and the clear light of day. In the Colorito technique, the colors are more muted and softer. With the disagonal technique, there's an emphasis on linear line and contour. With the Colorito technique, there's a focus on the specificity of the space and lots of detail in sort of communicating that space. And here, and the figures are much smaller. And with Raphael and the disagonal technique, we see that there's an emphasis on large, very sculptural figures. With Colorito technique and also Venetian painting during this time period, there's actually also the background is very important. It's so important sometimes that it's sometimes the most important thing as opposed to what is depicted in the foreground or the main subject. With high Renaissance painting on the mainland of Italy, such as Raphael over here, the background is more shallow and it's not as depicted in as great a detail. And then with the Colorito and Venetian technique, we see that the figures are definitely smaller, they're more slender, and they're more immersed in the background. And then with high Renaissance paintings such as Raphael and Michelangelo, we definitely see these more monumental figures that are in the foreground, and the background is not as important. I have these in my lecture notes, so you will have access to them, but please be able to, define these stylistic conventions for each of the regional styles of high Renaissance painting for Venice and Florence. So Colorito for Venice and disagonal for Florence. Venetian artists did do outdoor landscapes. This is another one by Giovanni Bellini. And this is St. Francis. He was the patron saint of animals. He was considered a nature lover. In this painting, he is depicted as standing in nature with palms facing upward, where he's about to receive the stigmata. Earlier representations of St. Francis would show an angel depicted somewhere in the image, but here the artist has chosen not to focus on that sort of mysticism. Instead, he's showing nature and sort of the divinity, that nature is divine. So we sort of see these sort of replacement of these, these divine religious symbols like angels and halos, and then using sort of everyday, like the landscape and the light, to kind of represent this divinity. So here's one of these earlier depictions of St. Francis that I was talking about earlier. Here you can sort of see the angel, and he's sort of, I guess he's sort of inflicting the stigmata onto him. And this is actually done by Giotto. Hopefully you remember that name. He was one of the artists that we talked about with the Proto-Renaissance, where there was that transition from Gothic to this sort of international Gothic style, and then it transitioned into this sort of awakening of the Renaissance. And here's a small thumbnail, again, just so you can see the difference. So, again, this sort of infusion of the scientific sort of observation of the world, but, infusing it with a Christian narrative and iconography is a characteristic of all high Renaissance art. Also, with the lighting depicted in Venetian paintings, high Renaissance paintings, there's a golden haze of light that's very different than the clear, crisp light depicted in Raphael's Cowper Madonna that we looked at earlier. And this golden light really envelops everything. And so that's one way you can sort of tell the difference between a Venetian high Renaissance painting and a mainland Italian high Renaissance painting. Also note the rocky landscape and how the figure of St. Francis is very small in contrast. And so here you really start to see how this idea of the background is so important and becomes even maybe more important than this sort of main figure of St. Francis. So there is that emphasis on the background and the landscape. And again, this is referencing this idea that God is nature. And when we look at some of the detail of this painting, we also notice there's this incredible study of nature. In the left middle ground, we see a depiction of a donkey, which can be interpreted as a symbol of humility and patience. In the lower right corner, there's a rustic sort of reading table, and you can't see it, but there's actually a skull on it. Let me see if I have... I don't know why that cut off. I'm so sorry. Here's the skull right here, and that's supposed to be representing mortality. And in the distance here, we see this empty heavenly Jerusalem. This is supposed to be the city of Jerusalem, which is supposed to not be inhabited yet. At least that's what your book said. And then also note the signature in my left-hand corner of the painting. And it's sort of this trompe-l'oeil effect where it looks like a sort of crumpled sheet of paper. And again, the artist is probably sort of showing off his ability. And again, as we pointed out, we definitely see the shift of the individual artist and this sort of, we start to see that artists are not remaining anonymous, and there's this sort of identity. We start to see that evolves, and these artists in many ways become sort of art superstars, like we discussed with Michelangelo and Leonardo da Vinci. So again, here's a comparison between Giovanni Bellini, the San Gobi altarpiece, and then Raphael and his Cowper Madonna. And I definitely think you can see the stylistic differences between the two. So this is a painting done by Titian, who really was sort of the equivalent, the Venetian sort of equivalent to Michelangelo. He was a very famous Venetian painter. And he really did have a long career and was a great rival to Michelangelo. And both of these artists lived a long time, which is unusual too. Michelangelo lived to be very old. And so, looking at these artists is interesting because we can also see how, their work changes from their earlier work and work they do later in life. The composition features two young, nearly nude women in the foreground of the landscape. There are two dressmen playing musical instruments that are situated in the mid-background. So here are the two women. And then the two men, it's interesting because they don't seem to really notice the females. And the lighting suggests that early morning, or maybe very, very late afternoon, but note the sort of yellow, sort of golden haze of the light. And then we really zero in on one of the details of a detail of the painting. We really do see this Colorito technique where they're sort of building up of colors and as opposed to outlining and sort of filling in. And also there's even this sort of use of sfumato that Leonardo developed in depicting the faces of the musicians. In looking at the details of some of the nude females, with Venetian painting and the depiction of the female nude, we see lots of rolling skin and flesh of nude figures, and they're very sensual and soft. And again, you get this sort of tactile feel, which is very different than this sort of disagonal linear style of Florentine Renaissance painting. And Titian becomes one of the most admired painters of flesh, and that's something that you'll hear about him, that he was so good at depicting flesh, and they have this this softness to their skin, and And then he's doing it sort of a comparison between the soft skin and then also the texture of the foliage. Remember, they did pay attention to these sort of details, in particular descriptive details with nature. There's also this attention to detail here as she's pouring water from this pitcher. And note how he's really done a good job accurately depicting the distortion in the water of this cisterine, which is what this pitcher would have been called, that she holds. And so there is this sort of, again, this paying attention to light and how light reflects and trying to really indicate that in a realistic, natural way. Venetian, this particular Venetian painting too is a little bit different in that it relies more on the use of atmospheric perspective as opposed to linear perspective. He's really focusing on these diagonals that sort of lead us into the depth of the painting, very much like that hunter scene that we saw by Peter Bruegel the Elder when we were looking at 16th century high Renaissance art in North Europe. And again, the gold hazy light. The meaning of this painting is unknown, and some scholars think that the subject was perhaps the allegory of poetry and music. The two women would be an imaginary apparition representing the ideal beauty, stemming from the two men's fantasy and inspiration. The woman with the glass face would be the muse of tragic poetry, while the other one would have been that of pastoral poetry. Of the two playing men, the one with the lute would represent the exalted lyric poetry, and the other being an ordinary lyricist, according to the distinction made by Aristotle in his writing Poetics. Another interpretation suggests that the painting is in a vocation of the four elements of the natural world: fire, water, earth, and air, and their harmonic relationship. Alright, so all this stuff I've talked about, this is another one by Titian, and you do have to know this one. Again, I will remember to put the stars up on the ones that you definitely need to know that are on the AP College Board's list of 250 works. But it is important, again, that I talk about some of these earlier ones and other examples, because just to show you one picture by Titian, you won't get an understanding of the style and sort of the development of high Renaissance Venetian painting. So I had to talk about those earlier ones for you to really discuss the Colorito technique and those sorts of aspects. So this was a portrait commissioned by the Duke of Urbano. It was thought to portray his mistress, and he was said to have kept it hidden behind a curtain. At the time, he had married his 12-year-old bride, and you have to remember during this time that marriages were alliances. And so he and his bride stayed in separate quarters till she came of age. And in the meantime, he had a mistress. And even when they were married, monarchs and dukes and these aristocrats usually had some sort of mistress. This is just an example showing you how Venetians have a long history of depicting what will be called the reclining female nude. This is another Venetian painter named Giorgione, and this is his version of the Sleeping Venice. So I just wanted to show you this example. You know, there are some differences. You know, Titian's is posed in an interior. You know, this is outdoor in the landscape. And, but anyway, it's an important characteristic, this idea of it's important history, art historical reference for Venice, this idea of the female reclining nude. So we're going to look at some details of the painting. In the background we see maidservants, and one is looking through a trunk or closet of some sort. And at this time, you know, she would have had servants that would have helped her dress. We do see some symbolism. The dog, I don't know if you remember the symbolism of the dog, but when we were looking at North European painting, it represented fidelity. Note the use of sfumato, or this sort of soft edge, or colorito technique, and depicting the soft rolling flesh of her body. And there's just this really gorgeous, exquisite texture that you get with using the colorito technique. Her hair, the sheets, the wrinkling of the sheets, and those, contrast with the smoothness of her flesh. In terms of viewpoint, she seems to be looking up at us. And this was supposed to be sort of a subservient idea that the Duke is looking down upon her. Her left hand loosely cups herself. And this is the idea that she is covering up her sexuality, but also drawing attention to it as well. Something that's also important to note is that Titian was also sort of showing off what a skilled painter he was. White is very difficult to work with in painting, the pigment white, and Titian is showing off how good he is by capturing different shades of white. If you really look at all these different shades he's used to describe the wrinkling of the sheets. And then also, the value and skin tone of her flesh. And, it really is quite technically just magnificent. And so, again, just to emphasize, the use of colorito was this technique of building up color first, and this is what creates these sort of soft edges. And so here is a compare and contrast. Hopefully you remember this is the statue of David by Michelangelo from Florence. And you do really get this difference, this sort of regional difference between Venice and Florence. So Venice is the city of the reclining female nude, and they're sort of, attributed to sort of developing this idea. And then Florence is the city of the male standing nude. And so that's all I have for Venetian art. I wish I could go into it a little bit more, because there's some really beautiful paintings and other great artists, but we don't have time. So our next segment is going to be on another development in High Renaissance art called Mannerism. So stay tuned. Also, please don't forget to look at the videos in your resource folder related to, Venetian art by Khan Academy.